Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Goldstone, and this is Not a Climate Scientist, the podcast where we talk with everyday Americans about the very real ways climate change is showing up in our lives and our livelihoods, what they're doing about that, and how we can all be part of the action. My guest today is super special. This is Jim Howell. He is a real life modern day cowboy, and he's trying to do things a little bit differently in a way that could benefit ranchers, ecosystems, and the global climate. I'm going to tell you right now, there are parts of this conversation that are pretty challenging. Both the math and some of the ideas that he's presenting are going to make you think. But it's well worth it, and I hope you'll stick with us. Jim Howell, thank you so much for joining me on Not a Climate Scientist. I know you are not a climate scientist, but you have worked with climate scientists, including some of my colleagues here at Woodwell Climate, to understand the impact of your land management practices, which we'll get to in a little while. And I have to say, they have described you as a real life modern day cowboy. I'm curious how that description lands for you.
Well, I definitely do consider myself a rancher and a cowboy, so I appreciate that they perceive me that way. Yeah, that lands pretty well with me. That's what I do most days here on my own ranch in central Colorado. And then I oversee the management of various other ranches. So I interact with a lot of cows and a lot of land and a lot of cowboys. And I'm definitely not a climate scientist. I would say I'm kind of a layman climate scientist because I've really become interested in that space over the last 20 years and have tried to understand how my career in ranching and land management and at scale potentially can impact this space of climate change and soil carbon, et cetera.
And in my experience, those who are out on the land, whether you've got a degree or not, there's nobody who knows the land and that system better because of all the time that you spend there.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at intimate detail at the soil surface every day as we try to figure out, the best, most sustainable, potentially regenerative way to interact with these landscapes day to day as we're crossing country horseback or walking or whatever. As we interact with our cows and our land, we're always looking at the soil surface to understand how our actions are actually impacting what we would say the effectiveness of the ecosystem processes, and trying to ensure that that our day-to-day management activities are nudging these landscapes in hopefully increasingly more biodiverse, healthy way.
I'm really curious what your day-to-day does look like. You did mention horses and walking. I'm curious how much of it is, our maybe storybook version of cowboy on a horse out on the range by yourself versus, I don't know, in a truck. And you already alluded to the fact that not only do you have your own ranch, you lead Grasslands LLC, a land management company. And when I first reached out to you, you said, yeah, let's talk when I get back from New Zealand.
Yeah, well, if I'm out here in my own ranch in central Colorado, which is up in a high elevation intermountain basin called South Park, I'm outside most of the time, moving cattle, putting up portable electric fence. Some of that moving cattle is horseback. Some of it is just calling the cattle. If it's an easy move, they're all trained to a call, which isn't that romantic.
Okay, I had no idea you could actually call cows.
Yeah, no, totally. You can totally train them. And usually the moves are to adjacent pastures, so it's fairly easy. So you give them I won't do the call on the podcast, but
oh, come on.
Come
on, give us the call.
You basically say, come on. Come on. And they hear you say that a few times, and they all like throw their heads up and they start bawling at you, and they start to meander in your direction and right through the gate. So most of the time it's pretty easy, but if you have to do a more of a long distance move, then we get horseback and gather everything up and push them where they need to go. So yeah, there's some of the romantic cowboy stuff, but out here where I'm at now on this big open prairie in South Park, all that work is fairly easy. Where I used to do a lot of ranching in western Colorado, it's all steep mountains, lots of timber, lots of oak brush in the lower elevations. You can't actually see the cattle because of the vegetation cover. So it's way tougher, and you're dealing with a lot of, steep country. You're fighting gravity all the time, and you find a little handful of cows that you're trying to get moved out of a 5,000 acre pasture, and you take them to the closest gate and hope you pick up a few more cattle on the way. Hopefully you don't lose them on the way to the gate. You get them through the gate, and then you turn around and you go back out and try to find another wad of cattle to get to the gate. If you were afoot, the cows would leave you in the dust. So you had to be able to keep up with the cattle. And so you needed to be horseback. And you couldn't do it with a four-wheeler or a motorcycle or a truck because, one, a lot of it was illegal to do that way. But secondly, there were no roads and no way to get around in a vehicle. And so you had to do it horseback. And that's one thing I like about Western ranching is that there's really no way to industrialize it. If we're going to continue to manage and interact with these big landscapes, there's no other way to do it than horseback. And so I like that part of it.
It certainly doesn't sound like there's a dull moment involved.
Not really. We never get bored. That's for sure.
Did you always want to do this? You mentioned that your family had a ranch. I think it was your grandfather was a rancher. So you grew up with this. It wasn't just storybooks and wild westerns and that kind of thing. You knew what was involved. Did you always want to be a rancher like your grandfather?
I definitely was always deeply interested in this way of life. And all my summers growing up, I worked for my granddad on my family's ranch there in Western Colorado. And he kind of nurtured me into the lifestyle. And he was a good horse person and good with cattle. And so he kind of held my hand and was really patient with me as a little guy and really kind of romanced me into it. And so, yeah, I always wanted to be a rancher, but when I was growing up, I didn't think I could make a living as a rancher. That was kind of the stereotype. Ranchers can't make any money. So I thought I wanted to be a livestock veterinarian. But then I came across the work of this guy named Alan Savory and realized that actually I could probably be a rancher and a profitable rancher if I kind of embraced some of his key insights. And so I started down that path in the late 80s and decided not to become a veterinarian and have been on that path ever since. And so
what are some of those key insights? What did you think you wanted to do differently, and how would that make ranching more profitable?
Yeah, well, I started to become aware that on my family's ranch, the way that our cattle were interacting with that environment was gradually causing its ecological degradation. And this was most obvious along our riparian areas, along our creeks. Most of our willows had been overbrowsed to extinction, and there was a significant amount of erosion on the edges of our creeks. And then we had these what we call parks, a meadow, basically. Our ranch was a mosaic of timber and brush and then big open parks. And the open parks were degrading biologically also to a couple of different plants, mostly Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions, both of which are introduced from Eurasia.
Which is kind of funny since we call it Kentucky sweetgrass.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why that got that name, but so both of those plants are quite resistant to continuous overgrazing. So overgrazing happens when a plant gets grazed and then it gets grazed again before it's had the time to fully recover its leaf area and its root biomass. So because we weren't controlling the cattle in terms of their timing of their access to those parks, they could just go up there. They'd come down in water, graze in the riparian zone, and then in the afternoon walk back up onto these parks and continuously graze them. And so Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions, because of their growth form, they can grow more prostrate and maintain a level of leaf area that enables them to stay alive. Whereas all the native,
so they just kind of stay flat to the ground and can avoid the grazing better that way.
Exactly, and they can maintain a level of leaf area that enables them to stay alive. Whereas most of the native bunch grasses that grow up in those high elevation parks are upright growing and highly palatable and gradually get overgrazed to death. And so that had happened across in all these high elevation parks. And I was aware of that when I was in college, but I didn't know what to do about it. And then I came across these insights of Savory, and suddenly I realized, oh, it's not the cow that's the problem. It's how that cow is interacting with the landscape that is the problem. And it doesn't matter if a grass plant gets severely grazed. That's not overgrazing. If it gets grazed in one event, if then that herd of cattle then move on and that grass plant has a chance to fully recover, to grow back effectively. And so that was one of his insights. And basically it's kind of encapsulated in this, just the fact that herbivory has been happening across landscapes, since the evolution of ruminant animals. And so inherently it has to be a sustainable activity, sustainable kind of interaction that goes out across these landscapes. And so if we can tweak the way we manage our domestic livestock so that they actually mimic the migratory behaviors, the movement behaviors of these native herbivores, potentially our livestock, our domestic livestock can integrate into these grassland landscapes, just like the wild herbivores that used to be here largely. So, that was one of the main insights. And, another one is just that the world works in a holistic way. So a grassland that is devoid of herbivores is not a whole ecosystem. It's missing a key component. A grassland that's missing predators and herbivores is not intact either. So you could have the herbivores out there, but if there aren't functioning populations of pack hunting predators, then the behavior of those herbivores totally changes. So if you go to a fenced off kind of game reserve, you think, oh yeah, all the herbivores are native, so it should all be wonderful. But if there's no predators in there, those native herbivores act exactly like unmanaged cattle or sheep or goats. And they create a mosaic of overgrazed and undergrazed patches within that game reserve. And it looks just
like... They just sit in one spot, essentially. They don't have any motivation to move. And
right. So it's not the herbivore that's the problem. It's the way the herbivore interacts with the landscape that's the issue. And so Savory came up with a grazing planning process that not only tries to honor these essential insights of timing of exposure to the plant and constantly moving as a part of the planning process, but also I mentioned that one of his insights is that management must be holistic. So you can't isolate parts in a natural kind of intact ecosystem and understand the whole ecosystem by studying the parts. You have to study the whole. That same principle applies to human businesses. And so as we have to think of our business from the point of view of its social soundness, its economic soundness, and its ecological soundness simultaneously. So the social element mainly revolves around the unique human values of that group of people, family, or employees of a business, and what really drives them and motivates them to get out of bed every day. And then just as important as ecological health is economic health. And so if we don't have a profitable business that can pay ourselves a living wage and also generate sufficient surplus to keep up with capital expense needs to maintain the infrastructure, maintain our house, our fences, our water systems, our corrals, our barns, unless we can create enough surplus, economic surplus to maintain our resource base, we don't have a viable business. And then if we're slowly degrading that ecological capital out there because our animals are not interacting with the landscape the way nature intended, and we gradually liquidate that ecological capital, like I realized was happening on my family's ranch, if that goes on indefinitely, you don't have a sustainable business either. So you need to be thinking about the ecology, the economy, and the human values or the social context. And so that's the approach that we try to take with our, my own properties, as well as the properties that I manage for my investor clients that the Grasslands manages. So that's kind of.
You said you were learning all of that in college. Did you take
that back to your? In college, yeah.
Did you take that back to your grandfather and to your family's ranch? What was the response? And yeah. I mean, did you make changes, and did you see changes?
Yeah, big time. By that point, my granddad had passed away a couple of years before I became aware of all this stuff, and so I never got to talk about all that with him. I think he would have been a little resistant, but probably also intrigued.
Yeah.
But my dad was an only child, and my granddad was a really hardworking man, and my dad didn't want to be a rancher. He decided he didn't want to be a rancher or a farmer, and so he pursued a career in education and coaching and athletics, and so he didn't get ingrained in his brain the way a specific way of doing things. My dad was totally open to it because, again, he didn't have these ingrained cultural habits. Really, he didn't like the way he grew up. And so he was like, yeah, if you have some other ideas, I'm all for it. And so he gave me complete autonomy to do whatever I felt like needed to happen. So yeah, I did that for 17 years, and we did all the planned grazing stuff that we learned from Savory, and were able to make a lot of improvement across our family's ranch. Those
Did you see the Kentucky sweetgrass and the dandelions go away?
No, they didn't go away, but the natives came back in, and so the natives, there were remnant populations of natives, mostly remnant individual plants that were surviving at the base of sagebrush plants, that were protected from severe continuous grazing by the sagebrush. And so once we changed that grazing pattern, we're able to give proper recovery periods to those high alpine parks, all those native grasses, the remnant plants that were there were able to express themselves and make seed and propagate. And so they became, whereas before they might have been 10% of the total grazable biomass up there, they they became 70-80% of the grazable biomass over the course of 17 years. So the Kentucky bluegrass and the dandelions were still there, but they were a minor component of the total forage base. And
It
so,
sounds so simple. I mean, you said it really doesn't take any extra money, probably some extra work. Does it require more land overall to grow the same amount of cattle, or what's the downside to doing this? Why isn't everybody doing it this way?
well, it doesn't take more land. Actually, you can run more cattle on less land.
Really?
Run more. You can increase stocking rate. Typically, like our average stocking rate increase was about double what
Wow, that's a lot.
happened under conventional grazing. Yeah. So under conventional grazing, the cattle tend to, like I've explained, spread up and down the riparian zones and go up onto their most select favorite alpine parks, typically under low density. And but if you constrict them down to a much smaller area, instead of just grazing the creek, they'll like we would typically graze cross sections of canyon, and maybe we'd have a 4 or 5 day grazing period on that cross section of a canyon. So the cattle would be in that area for 4 or 5 days. The first day you'd move in there, they'd graze the creek, obviously, because that's the easiest grass and the most lush, greenest grass right along the creek. So they'd first half day to a day, they'd graze the creek. And then by day 2, they're starting to climb the slope because they have to if they're going to fill their bellies. By the end of day 3, they're at the very top of the ridge, and they've started to graze that whole slope that historically got undergrazed. And that's why we were able to double our stocking rate, is because all this area of the ranch that historically wasn't getting utilized under a very low density continuous grazing suddenly was accessible to us. So to get back to your question,
I would say you've just added more reasons why this seems beneficial, and I'm
yeah,
even more
but
curious why. I mean, and I'm assuming not everybody's doing it this way. Why not?
because it takes a lot of mindful planning and close day-to-day observation. It's not necessarily more work because most ranchers work their butts off. This, in many ways, what we do is a little bit less work, in terms of the physical work, but the mental work is way more. It's a totally different culture compared to what ranchers are accustomed to doing. And that's, in my experience, as I've grown older, that's the hardest thing to change, is cultural habits and your own like identity, and what you do day to day as a rancher is your whole identity. And to suggest that it could be done better or it's been done poorly in the past and your previous generations of your family were managing in error is a hard thing to accept. And
It's really hard.
yeah, and so it's more of a cultural thing than it is really a day-to-day practical ability to get the work done thing. But as I say, that is changing. It's taken many decades, but that's changing. And I wouldn't say that this stuff that we do is necessary. It's not the norm yet, but it's definitely more normal than it was 30, 40 years ago.
So I want to broaden out a little bit because we've been talking mostly about the benefits of this kind of more holistic and ecological approach to grazing and cattle production, the kind of local benefits to the ranch and for that matter to the rancher, to the business. Where does climate change fit into all of this?
Well, if we can do this stuff that I've been describing at scale across the 5 billion hectares or 12 billion acres of grasslands
And I'm
across.
going to just stop you there for a second because I personally am horrible with acres and hectares and all of those things and have no idea what they mean. But I recently learned that grasslands and grazing lands cover a third of the
Right.
Earth's land area. It is huge. I mean, you were already mentioning big numbers, but like it's a third of land area. It is really, really huge.
Yeah, so the surface land area of the Earth is about 15 billion hectares, and about 5 billion hectares is grasslands or rangelands or kind of grassy shrublands. Tons of that area has been severely degraded, not only by poorly managed livestock, the eradication of the wild herbivores, and the natural grazing dynamics with healthy populations of herbivores and predators. Most of that's been eliminated. And it was replaced by poorly managed livestock, poorly pastoralists that, not to denigrate them at all, but we just didn't know what we were doing as humans in terms of how to integrate our livestock in natural ways across these big landscapes. And as a result, it's created a lot of degradation. But also most of the world's cropping, monoculture cropping, takes place across these 5 billion hectares that, part of which have been converted to croplands. They were tallgrass prairies or fairly productive prairies or grasslands, and now they're growing corn and soybeans and wheat. So there's, if you think about the amount of degradation that's happened, theoretically, there's room to fix all that and to reverse that degradation and get these landscapes back into a much more healthy state.
So the idea is that our land management practices, whether that's grazing or croplands, have released carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. That helps feed warming. And maybe if we changed those practices, we could walk that back and pull carbon back out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's the idea. And the estimates of the amount of carbon that have been lost from these terrestrial sinks, carbon sinks, are highly variable. But I have to think that it's enormous. And I came across one paper that was actually, it was like a meta-analysis of a bunch of papers. It was published in 1984, and it estimated that the amount of carbon lost from our terrestrial sinks was 500 gigatons of carbon, which is huge. Most of the more kind of modern day estimates are quite a bit lower than that, but I'll just go through a couple of like big picture numbers here. Like parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere right now is about 430. We're going up at a little over 2 parts per million per year every year. When I first became aware of this problem, we were at like 380, and we're already at 430. And we're on a trajectory to get to 500 almost without a doubt. So really, we should get back to 280, but that's like wishful thinking, really.
That's going to be really, really hard.
If we get back to 350, that'd be pretty awesome. Which means we need to reduce parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, assuming we get up to 500, by 150 plus parts per million. And that equates to about 300 gigatons of carbon. If that number is anywhere close to correct and we need to sequester 300 gigatons, theoretically, there's the room to put it back.
And how does moving cattle around differently on grasslands do that? How does it actually start to put organic matter back into the soil?
Well, because like I described on those high alpine parks on my family's place that were dominated by Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions, as they healed up and those native bunch grasses came back, what you see above ground is reflected below ground in terms of plant biomass. And the way that we actually manage those plants, and this has been researched a lot since I started doing this, by soil ecologists, trying to understand the capacity for perennial grasslands to actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere based on how that above ground plant biomass is managed. That there's a lot of detail there, but effectively, because of how we manage that above ground plant biomass, by grazing it and then giving it a chance to recover, grazing it again, you create this pulse, which results in root exudates being exuded into the soil profile.
What are exudates?
Like carbon-based compounds that are produced above ground through the photosynthetic process, that then are exuded out of root hairs in the form of simple sugars for the most part that go to feed soil microbes. That ends up stimulating that soil microbial population. Those microbes die. They become what's now my favorite term in soil science, which is microbial necromass. So,
it sounds like you've pretty much gotten a degree in soil carbon over the past few years, and you're trying to pass it on to all of us.
No, what I'm saying is like scratching the surface relative to what these guys are figuring out. But that you can build microbial necromass in the soil. That microbial necromass is a form of mineral, that those tiny particulates of microbes that decay and break down. They bind to clay particles in the soil and they form this mineral associated organic matter, which tends to be highly stable. And we can stimulate that formation of MOM, they call it. That's the acronym for mineral associated organic matter, by virtue of how we manage above ground plant biomass, which is a function of how we manage our animals. So we can.
I mean, like you said at the beginning, it's all connected. It's a holistic system, and when you tweak one thing, it has all sorts of ripple effects.
Exactly. And so one of those ripple effects is increasing MOM in the soil profile, which is a stable form of soil organic matter, which, the carbon continues to cycle, obviously. But as that carbon cycles, to the extent we can trap a little bit of it each time it goes around in the soil profile, and because of how we've managed animals and because of our monoculture cropping, a lot of that stable carbon has been lost. And so there's the capacity to grab it again as this carbon cycles and trap a little bit of it each time. So that's what we're trying to do. And if we can do that at scale, theoretically, we can make a dent in the problem and help this, this enormous challenge that's confronting humanity.
As you've alluded to, right, there's a lot of uncertainty about just how much potential this could have. There's a lot of research going on about what exactly, where the carbon is and how we get it there and how we keep it there and all of these sorts of things. But there is a lot of potential. And I think just as you talked about it being hard for ranchers to accept that a different way of doing things might be better, I think it could be hard for a lot of folks to accept that there might actually be a carbon or climate benefit to ranching, because the widespread advice and the prevailing wisdom is that producing beef as a source of protein takes an enormous amount of energy, it takes an enormous amount of water, it takes an enormous amount of land. And to reduce both our individual and our global impact on the environment, we should be eating less beef. How do you kind of square those things?
Well, we better do another podcast to explain all that, but I'll try to encapsulate it here. So the first thing is that the methane that the animals are emitting is carbon that's already cycling in the biosphere. So the carbon that's in that CH4 methane molecule was in the plant before the cow ate it. Before it was in the plant, it was in the atmosphere as CO2, and it got taken out of the atmosphere through the photosynthetic process. The cow eats the carbon, the grass, some of that gets exhaled as CO2, just like every animal does. But because she has a rumen, cows slowly eructate a little bit of methane all day, every day, because they're fermenting cellulose in their gut. The same thing happens in a wetland. The same thing happens in landfills. This anaerobic fermentation results in methane. But she exhales that methane. Methane has this half-life 7 or 8 years in the atmosphere, so it slowly oxidizes back to CO2 and water. So there's not a net buildup of methane in the atmosphere as a result of ruminant fermentation, digestion by grazing animals. It's all just part of the biospheric carbon cycle. Unlike methane that bleeds off a gas well or an oil well, that's methane that's supposed to be deep in the Earth's crust. And when we poke a hole in the earth to draw out natural gas and oil, we lose a lot of methane in the process. That is a net contributor to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Okay, maybe so, but if we just got rid of all the cattle, that would mean that there would just be a lot less methane produced on a daily basis anyway, and methane's a way more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So if we had less ruminants on this planet, we'd have less methane in the atmosphere at any given point in time, which is true. But going back to these semi-arid and arid landscapes, most of these landscapes have remnant populations of the native herbivores and predators that would have been there in a more natural state. So all those animals will fill in that ecological niche, and most of those animals are ruminants and producing methane. So that's just the way nature works.
There's going to be an herbivore there.
There's going to be an herbivore of some sort producing methane. So saying that we got to get rid of the cattle because there's too many herbivores, too many ruminant herbivores, is short-sighted, because those landscapes will get taken back up by bison and elk, or Mongolian gazelle, or Tibetan antelope, depending on what part of the world you're in. Another animal that's going to fill that grazing niche and produce methane.
And that might not be a bad thing from an ecological perspective, but it's not producing food for humans. And to your point, it's not necessarily changing the carbon cycle in the way that people might be thinking that cutting out meat would do.
Exactly. So
can I ask you one last question, which is, how can the rest of us support the work that you are doing to change the way that cattle are ranched, at least here in the US? Can we find products? Is there a way to find products that are ranched in the way that you're doing it?
Yeah, to an extent, there are, kind of specialized market niches with grass-fed regenerative beef that you can find. But it's not just commodity beef versus more well-managed beef that I think we should be focusing on. Even commodity beef is not nearly as bad as people say it is, because the majority of the feed input into the beef production system is feed that humans can't eat anyway, whether it's across these perennial grassland landscapes that we've been talking about, which is all land that's too dry, too steep, too rocky, too cold, too hot to raise crops in. The only way we can produce human food from it is with animals. There's a lot of pasture in the eastern U.S. and the southeastern U.S. that it would be crazy to turn it into monoculture cropping, even if you could. So there's a lot of feed across that part of the world. It isn't necessarily managed that well, but at least it's in perennial plants. And at least we're not, for the most part, not losing soil carbon on those perennial pastures, even though they're poorly managed pastures. A poorly managed perennial cow pasture is a way better carbon sink than a cornfield or a wheat field. So even though most of the cattle in the U.S. are not raised that well on the grasslands that they're on, at least for the most part, they're perennial landscapes. And if you're in the West, they're perennial native landscapes. And we're doing a little better job all the time of managing those perennial landscapes. And so in the U.S., though, because we have this massive overproduction of corn, and we also produce a huge amount of ethanol, a byproduct of which is distillers' grains, we have all this feed that we overproduce that has to go somewhere, and that's why we have this feedlot system. But that's only in the last 3 to 6 months of their life. Other than that, the mother cow's out on grass, the calf from that cow is on grass. Usually those calves are weaned and they're run for another year on grass till they're 18 months old. And then they go into a feedlot for an average of 4 months where they're finished. At the end of the day, my point is that relative to the way we produce food on the whole, even commodity beef is not that bad compared to bread, which is monoculture wheat that is severely degrading the environment, that has completely displaced the native grassland that would be there, which is now a wheat field. Nobody ever talks about that. Bread is from wheat. A wheat field is literal ecocide because you have to kill everything that's out there to grow the wheat. Same way with every crop that we grow. So the fact that, most of the input into the beef production system are these native biodiverse landscapes. Even if it's commodity beef that gets finished in a feedlot, it's not as bad as a slice of bread, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, certainly no simple answers.
No.
But a lot of food for thought, pun acknowledged. I want to thank you for opening up some of that complexity, getting past the simplifications and opening my eyes to a lot of new things, and for taking the time to do that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Not a Climate Scientist is a podcast from Woodwell Climate Research Center. Like and follow us wherever you're getting this podcast, and then head on over to our website to sign up for emails so you never miss an episode. Next time, it will be a conversation with pediatrician Samantha Adut. Talk to you soon.